There is a room inside you that you have never entered. You lock it every morning before you leave the house. You lock it before every conversation, every interview, every first date. You've locked it for so long, you've forgotten it's even there. But it hasn't forgotten you. It's been waiting, growing, watching every version of yourself you present to the world, and quietly taking notes. Carl Jung had a name for that room. He called it the shadow. And here is the part almost no one tells you. The people you call psychologically strong, the ones who seem unshakable, calm under pressure, impossible to manipulate, impossible to break, they are not the ones who run from that room the hardest. They are not the ones with the fewest flaws, the fewest wounds, the cleanest pasts. They are the ones who finally opened the door. Because real strength was never about hiding what's inside you. It was about facing it. Every ugly, embarrassing, terrifying piece of it, and choosing to stand there anyway. Jung didn't discover this sitting comfortably in a lecture hall. He discovered it by nearly losing his mind. He discovered it by staring directly into visions so dark he thought he was going insane, and finding, on the other side of that darkness, the exact blueprint for what makes a human being unbreakable. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened to him, exactly what he found in that darkness, and exactly how you can use it, starting tonight, to become the kind of person nothing can shake. Not because you'll have fewer wounds, but because for the first time, you'll stop being afraid of your own. Stay until the end, because the final piece of this, the part about the mask you're wearing right now, without even realizing it, is the part that changes everything. Part 1. The Golden Path. In 1907, a young Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Jung sat across from the most famous mind in Europe, Sigmund Freud. Their first conversation lasted 13 hours. Freud, already the founding father of psychoanalysis, looked at this brilliant younger man and saw something rare, a successor. Freud began calling Jung his crown prince, the one who would carry his life's work into the future. Think about what that meant. Jung had everything. A prestigious position at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, a wealthy, loving wife, a growing family, the backing of the most influential psychologist alive. By every external measure, Carl Jung, in his early 30s, had already won. And by 1913, he walked away from almost all of it. The break with Freud wasn't simple professional disagreement. It was personal, painful, and total. Freud believed the unconscious mind was built almost entirely from repressed sexuality. Jung believed it was something far larger, a vast, ancient layer of the human psyche shared across all of humanity, filled with symbols, myths, and forces older than any individual life. Freud saw this as a betrayal. He never spoke to Jung again after their split. So Jung, at 38 years old, lost his mentor, his professional inheritance, and much of his reputation in the psychoanalytic community. Almost overnight, he resigned from his university lecturing post. He stepped back from the movement that had defined his identity, and then something happened that no textbook could have prepared him for. Part 2. The Descent. Jung began to have visions, not metaphorical visions, waking hallucinations, vivid and relentless. He described seeing all of Europe drowning, literally drowning, in a sea of blood, the water rising over cities, over mountains, thousands of bodies floating beneath the surface. He saw this in October of 1913. He saw it again in the spring of 1914. He heard an inner voice telling him, "Look at it well. It is wholly real, and it will be so. You cannot doubt it." Jung was terrified. He was a trained scientist, a man who had spent his career studying the edges of sanity in other people, and now he seriously questioned whether he was losing his own mind. Then, in August of 1914, World War I broke out. Millions of young men would indeed drown in blood across the trenches of a continent Jung had seen collapsing in his visions months earlier. Jung realized, with a chill that never fully left him, that what had risen inside him was not a personal breakdown. It was something deeper trying to break through, something ancient and collective, using his own psyche as a doorway. He had two choices, and he knew it. He could suppress what was happening, medicate it away, bury it under work and denial, and hope it went quiet. Or he could do what almost no serious scientist of his era would dare, turn directly toward it. He chose to turn toward it every evening. After his patients had gone home and his children were asleep, Jung would sit alone in his study. He called what followed the confrontation with the unconscious. He deliberately allowed the images, the voices, the terrifying figures rising from inside him to speak, and he wrote every single one of them down. He drew them. He gave them names. He argued with them. He encountered a figure he called Philemon, an old man with the wings of a kingfisher, who spoke to Jung as an independent guide, sometimes contradicting Jung's own conscious beliefs. He met a figure representing raw, unfiltered violence he called Elijah's shadow. He descended again and again into what he called the underworld of his own mind, and he stayed there. This went on for roughly 6 years. 6 years of nightly descent into the darkest, strangest, most uncomfortable material his own psyche could produce. All of it was later compiled into a private manuscript, illustrated by his own hand, what the world now knows as the Red Book, a document so personal Jung refused to publish it during his lifetime. It wasn't released publicly until 2009, nearly 50 years after his death. Part 3. What he found. Here is the moment that changes everything about this story. Jung did not emerge from those 6 years broken. He emerged whole. Every major concept that would define his life's work, the personal shadow, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, the process he called individuation, all of it was forged directly inside that confrontation. The theories that would go on to influence not just psychology but literature, religion, art, and the way millions of people understand their own minds were built from the exact material most human beings spend their entire lives running from. Jung later wrote a line that should stop you cold. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. But notice something crucial. He only earned the right to say that sentence because he had already stood face to face, alone in a room, with everything that had happened to him, every fear, every violent impulse, every humiliating memory, every part of himself he was not proud of. He didn't transcend his darkness by ignoring it. He transcended it by exhausting every corner of it until there was nothing left to hide from. Part 4. The pattern in everyone else. Once Jung returned to his clinical work, he began to see the exact same pattern playing out in his patients, and eventually in entire nations. He noticed something almost mathematically consistent. The people who fell apart fastest under pressure were almost never the ones who had confronted their own darkness. They were the ones who had spent a lifetime pretending they didn't have any. A single unexpected insult, one moment of public humiliation, one flash of an anger they couldn't explain, and suddenly they became unrecognizable, saying and doing things that seemed to come from nowhere. But it didn't come from nowhere. It came from the locked room, the part of themselves they had never once met on their own terms, on their own schedule, in private. And because they had never met it there, it introduced itself instead in the worst possible moment, in front of the people whose respect they needed most. Jung watched this same mechanism operate on a civilizational scale. He watched, with growing dread, as a nation full of individuals who considered themselves cultured, moral, and civilized marched toward the horrors of the 1930s and 40s. He came to believe that collective evil doesn't erupt because people are secretly monstrous. It erupts because unexamined darkness, denied long enough in enough individuals at once, eventually finds a leader willing to wear it publicly for all of them. Out of everything Jung witnessed, in his own mind, in his patients, in the wreckage of a continent, he arrived at what may be the single most important warning in the history of psychology. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Sit with that sentence for a moment. Every pattern in your life you can't explain. Every relationship that ends the exact same way. Every time you swore to yourself you'd react differently, and didn't. Every sudden wave of anger, jealousy, or despair that seems to come from absolutely nowhere. Jung is telling you, directly, across more than 100 years, that isn't bad luck. That isn't just who you are. That is the unclaimed part of you, quietly steering the wheel from a room you never bothered to open, and calling the results your fate, when they were, all along, your unexamined self. So what does psychological strength actually look like? according to everything Jung risked his sanity to discover. Let's break it into what it is not, and then exactly what it is, with real practical steps you can start using tonight. What strength is not, Jung would tell you without hesitation, that psychological strength is not the absence of fear. It is not the absence of anger, jealousy, envy, doubt, or shame. Anyone who claims to feel none of those things is not strong. They are simply disconnected from half of who they are, and that disconnected half is exactly what eventually takes control at the worst possible moment. Strength is also not the performance of confidence. It's not the polished, filtered, unbothered version of yourself you present online or in the office. Jung had a specific word for that version of you, the persona. Borrowed directly from the Latin word for a theatrical mask, the persona is the face you show the world, the competent professional, the easygoing friend, the person who's totally fine. Jung didn't say the persona was evil. We need it. You cannot walk into every room as your rawest, most unfiltered self. But he warned, urgently, that the danger comes when you forget the mask is a mask. When you start believing the persona is the whole of who you are. Because everything the persona hides doesn't disappear. It goes into the shadow. And it waits. What strength actually is? Integration. Real psychological strength, in Jung's terms, comes down to one word: integration. It means you stop dividing yourself into the parts I show the world and the parts I hide even from myself. It means that when jealousy rises in you, you don't perform as though it isn't there. You get curious about it instead. When shame surfaces, you don't bury it faster than it appeared. You ask what it's protecting. This is what Jung called facing your shadow, and he considered it, without exaggeration, the single most defining act of psychological maturity a human being can undertake. Here is how you actually begin. Not in theory, tonight, without a therapist, without spending a single dollar. Pillar 1. Watch what irritates you disproportionately in other people. Jung called this mechanism projection. The traits that provoke the strongest, most disproportionate reaction in you are very often disowned pieces of yourself, staring back at you wearing someone else's face. The coworker who enrages you because they're so arrogant. Ask yourself quietly and honestly, is there a version of confidence inside me I've never let myself express? The friend whose laziness infuriates you. Is there a permission to rest that you've never given yourself? This doesn't mean every irritation is projection, but the reactions that feel wildly out of proportion to the actual offense are almost always pointing you back toward the locked room. Pillar 2. Stop performing the version of you that never struggles. Every time you hide a fear, a doubt, or a failure behind the mask of "I'm fine," you are not protecting yourself. You are feeding the exact shadow that will eventually seize control in front of the people whose opinion matters most to you. This doesn't mean broadcasting every struggle to everyone. It means, at minimum, being honest with yourself, in private, about what's actually happening inside you, rather than managing your own image, even in the privacy of your own mind. Pillar 3. Sit with discomfort instead of fleeing it. This is what Jung did for 6 years, nightly, alone in his study. You don't need 6 years. You need 10 honest minutes, alone, without your phone, without music, without distraction, letting yourself actually feel whatever you've been avoiding. The grief you never finished, the anger you swallowed to keep the peace, the fear you keep outrunning with busyness. You don't have to solve it in that sitting. You only have to stop pretending it isn't there. Jung called a more advanced version of this practice active imagination, deliberately engaging with the images and emotions that arise from the unconscious, almost like holding a conversation with them, rather than either suppressing them or being swept away by them. You don't need to master that technique tonight. You only need to start with the 10 minutes. Pillar 4. Recognize the archetypes running quietly beneath your behavior. Jung believed we don't just carry a personal shadow, we carry inherited patterns shared across all of humanity that he called archetypes. The hero, the caregiver, the wounded child, the wise elder, the trickster. These aren't superstition. They are recurring psychological patterns you can watch play out in your own decisions if you pay attention. Notice when you're operating from the wounded child, reacting from old hurt rather than present reality. Notice when you're stuck performing the hero, unable to ask for help because it would threaten the identity you've built. You don't have to eliminate these patterns. You have to see them clearly enough that they stop running you unconsciously. Pillar 5. Understand that individuation is the goal, not perfection. Jung called the lifelong process of integrating all of this the journey toward becoming yourself. Not the persona alone, not the shadow alone, but the whole unified person. Both faces of you finally standing in the same room, no longer at war with each other. He called this process individuation, and he was explicit that it is never fully finished. There is no final graduation, no day you arrive as a completed person with nothing left to face. The goal was never to defeat your darkness and become a being made only of light. It was to stop being ruled by the parts of yourself you refuse to look at. That is what real psychological strength is, not the absence of your darkest parts, the integration of them. Why this matters more than confidence? Here's what almost no one tells you about the confident-looking people you envy. Confidence that hasn't been built on integration is fragile. It's a persona with nothing underneath reinforcing it, and personas crack under pressure. Exactly the way Jung watched happen in his patients, and exactly the way you've probably watched happen to someone in your own life. But a person who has actually sat in the room with their own shadow, who knows exactly what their capacity for anger, jealousy, selfishness, and fear looks like, because they've already met it in private, cannot be destabilized the same way. You cannot threaten to expose something to someone who has already stood in front of a mirror and looked at it themselves. You cannot weaponize a person's shame against them once they've stopped being ashamed of being human. That is the real, practical, day-to-day payoff of everything Jung risked his sanity to discover in that study in 1913. Not enlightenment, not perfection, something far more useful, nothing left for the world to blackmail you with, because you already know what's in the room. So ask yourself the question Jung was really asking all of us. Across every page of that private manuscript he was too afraid to publish for most of his life. What have you locked away that's been quietly running your life without your permission? What's the reaction you can't explain? The pattern that keeps repeating? The version of fate that's really just the unclaimed part of you, steering from a room you've never opened? You don't have to open that door today. Jung didn't open his all at once either. It took him years, in private, in the dark, one image at a time. But you have to know the room exists. Because the moment you stop running from what's inside, you is the exact moment nothing outside you can control you anymore. That is what it means to be psychologically strong, not fearless. Not perfect. Whole. If this reached something in you, don't scroll away from it just yet. Sit with it for a moment, the way Jung sat with his own darkness. And in the comments, tell me, what's the one part of yourself you've been avoiding the most?